Lean close, because this is not the story you think you know. You've heard his name whispered in legends of buried treasure, sung in sea shanties, cursed in ballads. Captain William Kidd the pirate, who is said to have hidden untold riches on some lonely shore. But what if I told you the truth is far darker, more twisted, and more tragic? What if I told you that Captain Kidd may not have been the monster we were taught to fear, but a man betrayed, framed, and condemned by the very empire he once served? Picture this: London, 1701. A man stands in the dock at Old Bailey, iron shackles biting into his wrists. His face is gaunt from months of imprisonment, his eyes blazing with desperation. Before him, the court is packed lords, ladies, merchants, and spies, all eager for blood. The charges: piracy, murder, treason. The sentence, if found guilty, death by hanging, his body left to rot as a warning to all who dared follow his path. But here's the twist. William Kidd had not started as a pirate. He had been a respected privateer, commissioned by the Crown itself to hunt pirates, not join them. He sailed with papers stamped by England's highest powers, believing himself an agent of law and empire. Yet somewhere on the open sea, the line blurred. The hunter became the hunted, and in that blur, Kidd's fate was sealed. Was he guilty of crossing into piracy, or was he the victim of political betrayal, a pawn sacrificed to protect powerful men in London? Why did treasure turn up buried, hidden away on lonely shores, as if waiting for someone to find it centuries later? And how did a man entrusted to uphold the empire's law end up swinging from the gallows, his name forever etched into legend as one of history's most infamous pirates? The truth behind Captain Kidd's rise and fall is not just a pirate story, it is a tale of ambition, treachery, and a desperate fight for survival against forces far greater than any man could command. And it all begins with a single fateful decision that set him on a course from honor to infamy. William Kidd's story did not begin in the shadows of the gallows, but on the grey shores of Scotland, where the sea carved men into wanderers. Born around 1654, he was the son of a modest seaman, raised among cries of gulls and the salt spray of the North Sea, like countless boys of his station. William's childhood was shaped by the sea's cruel lessons. Ships broke, storms swallowed, and men returned home empty-handed, more often than they returned with gold. But for Kidd, the sea was not only a fact of life, it was an invitation. By the time he was a young man, Kidd had left Scotland behind. He drifted first into the Caribbean, where English colonies rose from tangled jungles and sandy beaches. Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands were cauldrons of wealth and violence, places where merchants grew fat on sugar and slaves, and corsairs struck fast for their share. It was here that Kidd found his calling as a privateer, a legalized predator of the seas. Privateering was a strange game of shadows. With a commission from a governor or king, a man could fly his nation's flag and attack enemy vessels, looting them with the blessing of law. To his victims, he was no different from a pirate. But to his patrons, he was a useful weapon. It was war disguised as commerce, piracy with a thin coat of respectability. Kidd excelled at it. By the early 1690s, Kidd commanded his own ship, raiding French prizes in the Caribbean during the 9 Years' War. His boldness and charm won him admirers among both sailors and governors. In 1691, fate tilted in his favor when he married Sarah Bradley Cox, one of the wealthiest widows in New York. With her fortune, Kidd stepped into colonial high society. The son of a poor seaman was now rubbing shoulders with merchants, landowners, and officials. For the first time, Kidd tasted the possibility of permanence, of legitimacy. But Kidd was not meant for quiet dinners or slow fortunes. His eyes turned back to the sea, where riches lay waiting. In 1695, his chance arrived. Piracy in the Indian Ocean had grown into a plague. French raiders and outlaw Englishmen preyed upon merchant fleets bound for India, Persia, and Arabia. The East India Company, whose fortunes flowed from those waters, cried out for help. And so, in London, the idea of a grand expedition was born. Powerful investors, including the Earl of Bellamont and even King William's advisors, backed the plan. William Kidd, respected in New York and seasoned on the sea, was chosen to lead it. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Kidd would command the Adventure Galley, a ship purpose-built for both speed and war, armed with 34 guns and manned by a hardened crew. His commission was clear: hunt pirates, seize their vessels, and strike at France's shipping. In his chest he carried royal papers signed with the Crown's authority. With such backing, he believed his future secure, but beneath the fine ink of his commission lay danger. The investors expected profit, not excuses. The East India Company's interests were fickle, shifting with politics, and Kidd's crew-off men, drawn by promise of plunder, would not tolerate long months without spoils. A privateer walked a razor's edge between hero and outlaw. One misstep, and the rope awaited. The Adventure Galley sailed from London in 1696. From the start, the voyage was cursed. The ship leaked constantly, her timbers groaning. The crew muttered about poor provisions. Months passed with little prize to show. When Kidd spared neutral ships, obeying the strict limits of his commission, his men grumbled. Whispers of mutiny curled through the decks. Tension boiled one day when Kidd quarreled with his gunner, William Moore. In the heat of words, Kidd struck him with an iron-bound bucket. Moore collapsed, his skull shattered. He died hours later. It was a single act, born of rage, but it shadowed Kidd forever. The Crown would later call it murder. Still, the voyage dragged on. Hunger gnawed, tempers frayed, and then, in 1698, came the ship that sealed Kidd's fate, the Quedagh Merchant. The vessel was Armenian-owned but sailed under French passes, carrying silks, spices, and treasure worth thousands. To Kidd, it was fair game. France was England's enemy, and the papers made the capture lawful. His men, near rebellion, cheered as the prize was taken. For a brief moment, fortune seemed to smile. The holds brimmed with riches, and Kidd could finally promise his investors a return. But law is not forged on the deck of a ship. News of the capture raced back to India and London. The East India Company, furious, claimed the Quedagh Merchant was protected under their trade. Kidd, they argued, had not upheld the law, he had broken it. Powerful merchants bayed for his blood. The Crown, eager to appease them, shifted blame onto the very man they had commissioned. By the time Kidd sailed back toward the Americas, the tide had turned. He was no longer the Crown's servant, but its scapegoat. Pamphlets branded him a pirate. His name darkened tavern whispers. He was, in the eyes of England, already guilty. Sensing the storm, Kidd made a desperate move. On Gardiner's Island, off Long Island's coast, he buried treasure gold jewels, silks, and coins hidden in haste. Was it meant as a bargaining chip, proof he could still deliver? Or was it fear, the instinct of a man who knew the hangman waited? Whatever the reason, the act birthed one of history's great legends. For centuries, men would dig in vain, chasing the ghost of Kidd's hoard. When he finally reached New York in 1699, Kidd expected refuge. He had powerful patrons, after all the Earl of Bellamont among them. Surely they would shield him. But politics is colder than the sea. England wanted a scapegoat to soothe the East India Company's fury. Bellamont, his hands stained with Kidd's commission, chose survival over loyalty. He betrayed Kidd, had him arrested and shipped to London in chains. In Newgate prison, Kidd wasted in filth and despair. The walls dripped with damp, the straw crawled with lice, and the stench of rotting flesh hung in the air. He wrote desperate letters, insisting on his innocence, begging for an audience with the king. But his words were as dead as the rats gnawing in the corners. When at last he was dragged to trial at Old Bailey in 1701, Kidd stood not as a man but as a symbol. The judges were stern, the gallery packed with lords, merchants, and curious spectators. His enemies painted him as a pirate, a murderer, a traitor to the crown. Kidd argued back, his voice rising, reminding them of his commission, of his duty. But the court had already chosen its story. The hunter had become the hunted. The servant of empire had become its sacrifice. And William Kidd, who had once sailed with the crown's blessing, now stood on the edge of the noose. But before the rope tightened, the question remained, was he truly guilty? Or was he the victim of a betrayal that reached into the highest halls of power? London, 1701. The city was a furnace of gossip, scandal, and hunger for blood. The streets around Old Bailey swelled with people, their voices buzzing like hornets. Word had spread that William Kidd, the notorious pirate who had once been hailed as a loyal servant of the crown, was to stand trial. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others for the spectacle, and many because Kidd's name had already been written into infamy by pamphlets and ballads. But the man they saw dragged into the courtroom was no swaggering pirate. Shackled in irons, Kidd's face was thin from 2 years in Newgate's filth, his hair streaked with grey. His eyes burned still, but the fire was mixed with desperation. He stood in the dock not as a conqueror of seas, but as a man betrayed, carrying the weight of a crown that had turned its back on him. The gallery was packed with lords, merchants, and ministers. Nobles leaned forward on their benches, powdered wigs gleaming, lips curled in disdain. The East India Company's representatives sat stiff-backed, their eyes sharp and cold. Pamphleteers scribbled notes, ready to twist the day's proceedings into sensational headlines by nightfall. The air reeked of damp wool, sweat, and ink. The charges were read aloud. Kidd was accused of piracy on the high seas, of seizing ships not authorized under his commission, of murdering his gunner, William Moore. Each charge echoed through the chamber like the tolling of a bell. The Crown's case was simple. Kidd, entrusted with power, had turned rogue. He was not a privateer, but a pirate, a traitor to the empire. Kidd raised his head, his voice hoarse but defiant. "I had the king's commission," he declared. "I acted under the authority of the crown. If I erred, it was not piracy but mistake. Made in service of England." The court did not stir. Witness after witness was brought forward. Some were sailors from the Adventure Galley, men who once drank and bled beside Kidd but now testified against him. They spoke of his temper, of the day he struck William Moore with an iron-bound bucket. He killed him outright, one man swore, though others remembered Moore dying slowly, cursing Kidd with his last breaths. The judges did not care for the details, only the blood had been spilled. Then came the matter of the Quedagh merchant. Lawyers argued that the vessel was not a lawful prize. That Kidd had knowingly seized a ship protected under the East India Company's trading privileges. Kidd's papers were dismissed, his explanations ignored. To the merchants in the gallery, Kidd was not a privateer defending the Crown's honor. He was a threat to their fortunes. Again and again, Kidd rose to defend himself. His voice carried desperation, but also conviction. I was sent to hunt pirates. I took only those ships that bore the mark of France. My commission bears the seal of my lords themselves. If I am guilty, then so too are they who sent me. That was the problem. Kidd's trial was not only about Hemet, was about shielding powerful men from blame. The Earl of Bellamont and other investors had signed his commission. If Kidd was found innocent, their dealings with piracy and profit would come under scrutiny. If Kidd was guilty, however, their hands were clean. The trial became a theatre of survival. The Crown needed to appease the East India Company, whose wealth and influence were unmatched. The nobles needed a scapegoat to bury their complicity. And so, every argument Kidd made fell on ears deafened by politics. He begged for time to gather his papers, to prove his commission. His requests were denied. He demanded the testimony of allies who knew his orders. They were not called. At one point, Kidd shouted in frustration, "I have been denied the evidence that would clear me. Is this justice, or is it murder in robes?" Gasps rippled through the gallery, but the judges sat unmoved, their quills scratching like nails across wood. For 2 long days, Kidd battled in that courtroom. His every word was twisted, his every defense drowned beneath the tide of political necessity. Pamphlets outside already branded him the pirate of the Indian seas. Songs mocked him as a coward and a murderer. The noose was tightening, and he could feel it. On the final day, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts: piracy, murder, and robbery. Kidd's fate was sealed. The sentence was death. He was to be taken to execution dock in Wapping, hanged by the neck until dead, and his body tarred and hung in chains along the Thames as a warning. The words rang like cannon fire, final and merciless. In the dock, Kidd stood silent for a long moment. Then, with a voice steady but low, he said, "I have been betrayed by my friends and by those who sent me. I die an innocent man, though the world will not believe it." The court buzzed with whispers, some mocking, others uneasy. For there was truth in his words, and some knew it. But the machine of empire ground on, indifferent to one man's protest. Afterward, Kidd was dragged back to Newgate. In his cell, by the guttering light of a candle, he scrawled desperate petitions to Parliament, to the King, to anyone who might listen. He wrote of his commission, of his loyalty, of the injustice of his trial. But his letters were never answered. The Crown had its scapegoat, and Kidd's voice would be silenced by rope. Yet even as his execution drew near, rumours spread of treasure still hidden. Gardiner's Island, it was whispered, held a hoard buried by Kidd himself, proof that he had planned to return triumphant or bargain with riches for his life. Pamphlets fanned the flames, painting him as a pirate who mocked the crown with gold hidden beneath its very nose. For the people of London, Kidd was already half legend, half devil. But the truth, perhaps, was far stranger, for William Kidd had sailed under the Crown's flag. He had papers bearing noble signatures. He had done the bidding of men who now pretended they had never known him. He was not simply a pirate. He was a man sacrificed to protect power, condemned not only for what he had done but for who needed him to fall, And as the day of his execution neared, the question grew sharper. Would Kidd die as a pirate in the people's eyes, or as a martyr to treachery in the eyes of history? The days after William Kidd's conviction passed like shadows creeping across the walls of Newgate. In the foul stench of the prison, Kidd paced the narrow cell allotted to him, his shackles dragging with every step. The verdict had struck like a cannonball final, crushing, leaving him no illusion of hope. Yet still, he wrote. Still, he pleaded, by the dim flicker of a tallow candle. His quill scratched across parchment, letters to the lords, petitions to the king, desperate appeals to the world outside that seemed deaf to him. I am no pirate, he wrote, his hand trembling with fatigue. I acted by commission, by authority. If I am guilty, then those who gave the orders are guilty, too. I am undone not by the sea, but by treachery. The jailer, collecting the papers, smirked as he tucked them under his arm. The letters, of course, never reached their destination. Some were destroyed, others quietly suppressed. The powerful men Kidd named his investors, his protectors turned betrayers, wanted his voice silenced, not heard. Yet Kidd's words did not vanish completely. They leaked, whispered by sympathetic ears, passed hand to hand in taverns and alleys. Some began to see him not as a pirate, but as a scapegoat, sacrificed to satisfy the fury of the East India Company and the politics of London. But the wheels of justice or injustice moved on. His execution date was set, May 23rd, 1701. Execution day dawned grey and wet, the Thames cloaked in mist. By mid-morning, crowds surged toward Wapping, eager for the spectacle. Executions at Execution Dock were not rare, but this was no common hanging. This was Captain Kidd, the pirate of pamphlets and legend, the man said to have buried treasure that might still lie waiting in the earth. Merchants in fine coats rubbed shoulders with beggars in rags. Women clutched children to their skirts, whispering warnings about the wages of sin. Street sellers hawked ballads and broadsides, each promising lurid details of Kidd's crimes. The last confession of Captain Kidd, they cried, though most were written by men who had never spoken to him. Sailors pressed close, some jeering, some watching with grim silence. Through the press of bodies came the condemned, dragged in a cart from Newgate. Kidd sat shackled, his face pale, his back straight despite the weight of irons. At his side were two others condemned for piracy, but it was Kidd the crowd had come to see. His name alone carried the electricity of scandal. The procession creaked through the streets, past taverns and warehouses, until it reached the riverside gallows at Execution Dock. The scaffold loomed above the mud, the noose swaying gently in the damp wind. Here, for generations, pirates had met their end, their bodies afterward chained and left to rot as warnings. The river lapped hungrily at the shore, as if eager to claim another soul. Kidd mounted the scaffold with steady steps. The hangman adjusted the rope, his rough hands efficient, practiced. The priest muttered final prayers, urging Kidd to repent, to confess fully before God. Kidd lifted his head and spoke, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. I die a wronged man, he said. I have been betrayed by those who sent me. I am not the pirate they make me, but a man undone by power and politics. Remember, this justice has not been done here. The words rippled through the throng. Some scoffed, some muttered agreement, and others shivered. For though Kidd stood on the scaffold, his gaze unwavering, there was conviction in his tone that no rope could strangle. The hangman pulled the hood, tightened the knot. The drumbeat rolled. Kid's lips moved in final prayer, though none could hear the words. The signal was given. The trapdoor fell, and in that instant, fate played its cruelest trick. The rope snapped. Gasps tore through the crowd as Kid plunged to the ground, striking hard in the mud below. For a moment, silence reigned. Then cries rose, a miracle. God has spared him. Hang him again. The hangman, shaken, hauled Kid back to his feet. His face was bloody, his body trembling from the fall, but his eyes burned. "Do you see?" he rasped, turning to the crowd. "Even the rope denies my guilt." But the authorities would not be swayed. The hangman fetched a second rope, tested it twice, and dragged Kid once more to the scaffold. The crowd roared with a mix of awe and horror. Some begged for mercy, others demanded blood. Once more, Kid stood with the noose around his neck. This time, when the trapdoor fell, the rope held. His body jerked, twisting, the air choked from him. The crowd watched in grim fascination until at last he hung limp. Life gone, his corpse was taken to the riverside, tarred and hung in chains at Tilbury Point. For years, his body swayed over the Thames, a grim sentinel warning all who passed that piracy, whether real or imagined, ended in death. Sailors crossing the river at night swore the corpse groaned in the wind, its empty eyes still burning with defiance. But Kid's death did not end his story. It only birthed legend. Pamphlets proclaimed him a monster, yet whispers persisted that he had been wronged. Treasure hunters began digging along coasts and islands, convinced that Kid's hoard still waited. The snapped rope became a symbol, some calling it divine judgment, others proof that fate itself had tried to save him. Even as his bones rotted above the Thames, Kid's name grew larger than life. Was he a pirate, a murderer, a villain who deserved his fate? Or was he a scapegoat, sacrificed to shield powerful men from shame? The crowd at Wapping had seen a body swing, but the truth, like the treasure, remained buried. The crowd that had thronged the execution dock went home whispering, some muttering of divine judgment, others swearing they had seen proof that William Kidd was no common criminal. Yet while his body swung in chains, tar dripping into the Thames, his legend slipped loose of the noose, for Kidd had left behind something far more enduring than a corpse. The promise of buried treasure. It began with Gardiner's Island, off the coast of Long Island. Before his arrest, Kidd had landed there with his men and secured the permission of the Gardiner family to leave chests and bundles in their care. He insisted they be kept safe, untouched, until he returned. Within weeks of his capture, the hoard was seized by colonial authorities. Bags of gold dust, bars of silver, silks, and jewels worth thousands. These goods were shipped to London, paraded as proof of Kidd's guilt. Yet the gesture sparked something unintended. The realization that if Kidd had buried treasure once, he might have done so again. Rumors spread like wildfire. Sailors swore he had hidden vast riches on other islands along the American coast. Some claimed the Caribbean was dotted with his secret caches. Others whispered of chests sunk deliberately in riverbeds or buried under ancient oaks. Kidd's trial may have condemned him, but his supposed treasure kept him alive in imagination. Almost immediately, treasure hunters began to dig. On Gardiner's Island itself, locals scoured beaches and coves for overlooked chests. Farther afield, men with spades prowled Long Island, Connecticut, and even the rocky coasts of Maine, convinced Kidd's ghostly hand had pointed him toward their fortune. In New England towns, children grew up hearing tales of a pirate's gold hidden in their very fields. Guarded by curses and spirits, the frenzy grew in the Caribbean. Sailors in Port Royal whispered that Kidd had buried silver in Jamaica's Blue Mountains. On Hispaniola, rumors placed his gold in caves sealed with stone. In the Bahamas, treasure seekers tore through sandy keys, hoping each mound might hide a chest stamped with the initials WK. Every time a storm revealed a broken plank of shipwreck, someone swore it belonged to Kidd's fleet. But it was not only sailors and peasants who hunted. Gentlemen in London invested in expeditions, dispatching ships to scour remote islands. Colonial governors eyed their coasts greedily, dreaming that Kidd's lost gold might fund their ambitions. Even poets and writers fanned the flames. Ballads claimed his treasure was cursed, guarded by demons or the restless ghost of Kidd himself, who would never let a thief take what he had hidden. One of the strangest tales came from New Jersey, where farmers swore they heard clanking chains at night near a patch of earth that glowed faintly under the moon. They dug feverishly, only to abandon their efforts when an apparition, a shadow with blazing eyes, rose from the soil. They swore it was Kidd's spirit, warning them away on Block Island. Fishermen told of a great chest dragged halfway up from the sand by a team of oxen, only for it to vanish in a blaze of fire when one man cursed God for its weight. In New England, families swore they found coins stamped with strange markings, proof of Kidd's hand. Each story added fuel to the legend until fact and fiction blurred entirely. The irony was bitter. Kidd had died proclaiming his innocence, insisting he had been betrayed by his powerful backers. Yet the world ignored his words and instead clung to the myth of his gold. He had tried to save himself with buried treasure, hoping it might serve as bargaining power. Instead, it doomed him to an immortality of falsehood. He was no longer a man, but a ghost, forever tied to hoards that may never have existed. But not all of it was fantasy. The Gardiner's Island treasure was real, documented and accounted for. Fragments of Kidd's wealth had been tangible. That sliver of truth made the rumors unstoppable. If one hoard had been found, why not others? As the decades passed, Kidd's name became shorthand for mystery and greed. Colonial America's obsession with him seeped into folklore. Parents frightened children with tales that Kidd's ghost would snatch them if they wandered too near the shore at night. Young men dreamed of stumbling upon a chest of gold that would free them from toil forever. Ministers thundered from pulpits that Kidd's cursed fortune was a warning from God, proof that ill-gotten gains led only to damnation. The legend even crossed oceans. In England, broadsides proclaimed Kidd's hoards lay waiting, mocking the crown from the bottom of the sea. Treasure hunters launched expeditions to Madagascar, where Kidd had once sailed, digging among beaches and reefs. Each failure only seemed to make the myth grow stronger. By the 19th century, the hunt for Kidd's treasure had become almost a national pastime in America. Farmers, fishermen, and adventurers alike tore up fields and coastlines, armed with shovels and dreams. Even men of letters like Washington Irving wove Kidd into their stories, transforming him into a figure half historical, half supernatural. In Irving's tales, Kidd's treasure was cursed, guarded by spectral sentinels who rose to defend it. The truth hardly mattered anymore. Every strange light on the water, every coin found in the dirt, every whisper of chains rattling in the wind was tied to Kidd. He had become more than a pirate, more than a scapegoat. He was a ghost king of hidden riches, forever luring men to madness with promises of gold. And yet, beneath the legends, a darker question lingered. Had the treasure hunts been encouraged by those same powers who betrayed him? Did whispers of kids' hoards serve as convenient distractions, leading common men to dig in vain while the true wealth of empire was plundered openly by companies and nobles? Was Kidd's legend itself part of the great deception, a smokescreen to bury the truth of his trial? Standing in chains at execution dock, Kidd had declared, "I am undone not by piracy, but by treachery." Perhaps the treasure was never the chests of gold, but the story, itself a tale crafted to mask betrayal with glittering distraction. Still, the earth was dug, the coasts carved, the seas searched endlessly, and as spades struck stone and lanterns flickered in the dark, men swore they heard laughter deep, mocking, carried on the wind. The laughter of Captain Kidd, whose curse was not only that he was hanged, but that he would never be allowed to rest. Even as Kidd's tarred corpse swayed above the Thames, the legend of Captain William Kidd began to grow beyond the reach of history. His death at execution dock might have been meant as a warning, but it became something else entirely, a spark that lit centuries of obsession. What the hangman ended, the storytellers began by the 18th century. Kidd was no longer only a pirate or a scapegoat, he was a ghost. His name whispered through taverns, sea shanties, and bedtime stories. From the rocky shores of New England to the plantations of the Carolinas, families told children to beware the restless spirit of Kidd, doomed to wander until his treasure was found. His ghost was said to pace beaches, dragging chains, or to appear as a shadowy figure with burning eyes guarding hidden chests. In Massachusetts, fishermen swore that lantern lights bobbing on the water at night were not fellow sailors, but Kidd's phantom crew, searching eternally for their lost fortune. In Rhode Island, rumors claimed that Kidd's ship could still be seen on stormy nights, sails black against the lightning, cannon fire rumbling in the thunder. Farmers in Connecticut dug up fields not for crops but for gold, guided by dreams in which Kidd's ghost whispered, the location of his hoard only for the ground to yield nothing but rocks and disappointment. Most persistent legends painted Kidd not merely as a ghost but as a cursed soul. Some said that when he buried his treasure, he killed one of his crew and left the body as a guardian spirit. Anyone who dug for the gold would have to contend with the murdered man's shade. Others insisted Kidd had made a pact with the devil himself, trading his soul for wealth, and that his treasure could never be claimed without blood. As the Enlightenment gave way to Romanticism, the figure of Kidd entered literature. Washington Irving, in the early 19th century, immortalized him in stories like The Devil and Tom Walker. In Irving's hands, Kidd's buried treasure was no mere gold, it was a temptation, cursed and guarded by infernal powers. The very act of seeking it was a moral test where greed could damn a man's soul. Kidd, thus, became less a man and more a symbol of temptation, corruption, and the cost of ambition. Other writers followed. Ballads and poems spread across the Atlantic, each layering new colors onto his myth. Some painted him as a romantic outlaw, betrayed by powerful men, yet still master of his destiny. Others cast him as a villain whose greed poisoned the earth itself. But always, always, his treasure was the centerpiece, the glittering lure that explained his ghost's unrest. Meanwhile, treasure hunters did not stop. The 18th and 19th centuries saw wave after wave of hopeful men tearing up coasts and fields. On Long Island, men claimed to have found strange coins, weathered but gleaming, stamped with marks no one could place. In Connecticut, A farmer digging for Kid's gold was said to have struck a chest, only for it to sink back into the earth as if swallowed by the devil. On the Jersey coast, locals swore to have unearthed chains, rusted but still strong, that had belonged to Kid's men. Ghost stories multiplied alongside these hunts. In Maine, families said they heard phantom cannon fire offshore, Kid's ghostly ship still locked in endless battle. In New Jersey, children were warned never to wander near certain coves, for Kid's spirit would rise from the waves and drag the curious into the deep. In New England churchyards, gravestones were sometimes whispered to hide the bones of men Kid had slain as guardians for his treasure. The folklore spread beyond America. In the Caribbean, Kid became part of a wider pantheon of pirate spirits, said to haunt reefs and shoals, warning sailors away from danger or luring them to it. In Scotland, where he had been born, old sailors told tales of the lad from Dundee who had risen high only to be betrayed, his ghost now wandering far from home. Even in London, long after his bones had fallen from their chains, mothers hushed children with tales that Kid's ghost prowled the Thames, seeking vengeance on those who wronged him. What made Kid's legend endure was not only the lure of treasure, but the ambiguity of his story. Unlike Blackbeard, who revelled in his image as a demon of the seas, Kid had claimed innocence until the end. He was both pirate and victim, criminal and scapegoat. That uncertainty gave his ghost power. He could be a devil guarding cursed gold or a martyr wronged by empire. Every generation found its own version of Kid to believe in. The 19th century, with its hunger for adventure tales, kept his ghost alive. Novelists wove Kid into their stories, often blending fact and fiction until the line vanished entirely. Treasure maps, sometimes forged, sometimes simply imagined, circulated with his name scribbled in the margins. Young boys dreamed of discovering his hoard, spades in hand, eyes wide with greed. Even respectable historians, when pressed, admitted that no one could prove whether all of Kid's treasure had been recovered. The ghost of Kid haunted more than just beaches and books, it haunted imaginations. He became a figure of rebellion, a man who challenged empire and paid the price. At the same time, he was a warning that ambition could drag even the most respected man to the gallows in taverns. Sailors still sang ballads of him, verses of gold and betrayal echoing over mugs of ale. Some claimed they had seen his ghost firsthand. One story told of a sailor walking alone on a foggy beach in Rhode Island, who spotted a tall man with burning eyes and ragged clothes digging furiously in the sand. When the sailor approached, the figure turned, and the face was William Kid's, pale, hollow, and grinning. The sailor ran, and when he returned with others, nothing remained but the impression of chains in the sand. Another tale, told in Boston, claimed that a man who mocked Kid at a tavern stumbled home drunk only to vanish. Days later, his body washed ashore, his pockets filled with wet sand and a single gold coin clutched in his hand. These stories kept Kid alive long after history had closed its book on him. His trial might have condemned him, his execution might have silenced him, but the people refused to let him go. In their stories, he still walked, still laughed, still hunted, and in their digging, they still hoped, still dreamed, still believed Kid the man had been broken by politics and betrayal. But Kid, the ghost, was immortal, and somewhere, beneath the soil or the sea, people swore his treasure still waited. 3 centuries later, Captain Kid still will not rest. Was he a pirate consumed by greed, or a loyal man betrayed by empire? Is his treasure still hidden beneath sand and stone, or was the true treasure the scandal of his story itself, buried by the powerful to protect their own? If you thought this tale was wild, wait until you hear the next untold pirate story, the bloody rise and cursed fate of Black Bart, the most successful pirate who ever lived.